Welcome back, friends. It's good to see you again. In our last discussion, we focused on the role of both Mohandas K. Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru in not supporting Subhash Chandra Bose's Indian National Army. In fact, they did not even attempt to weaken the British Indian Army by calling on the Indian soldiers, who were the majority, the vast majority in the British Indian Army, calling on those Indian soldiers to refused to take orders from the British officers. Now, that would have, as I said in the last discussion, would have weakened the Indian Army and more precisely, weakened the British Indian Army and perhaps contributed to the victory of Subhash Chandra Bose's Revolutionary Army. And I also discussed that in the process, what both Gandhi and Nehru did was to actually stunt the growth of India's national character. But that is a rather contentious issue. I'll come back to it later. And the stunting I pointed out was evident in the way Nehru was unable to actually deal with Chinese Prime Minister Zhou Enlai in the negotiations over the border issue. But this lack of foresight and an ability to deal as equals has also brought out, or what has come to the to be clear in India's dealing with the United States. As you know by now, India has virtually capitulated to Washington and is willing to toe Washington's line. One reason, not the only one reason was New Delhi's fear of Beijing, that New Delhi may not be able to confront Beijing as an equal. And therefore, New Delhi began to lean on Washington and use the United States as a crutch, as a political crutch. Compare this with the history of Cuba, a tiny island compared to India, a vast subcontinental unit. This tiny island of Cuba has stood up to the United States since 1959. For several decades, the United States has carried on economic war, which is imposing sanctions and boycotts. It also carried out military intervention, as in the Bay of Pigs. And the US intelligence agencies, primarily the CIA, has carried on destabilizing interventions, including attempts to assassinate the head of Cuba, Fidel Castro. If this tiny island of Cuba can stand up to the United States, which is its neighbor, as you know, if it can stand up to the United States, then India, which is a vast country, halfway across the world, cannot stand up to the United States, there's a problem. And there may be many reasons. One reason I attribute to the Gandhian Satyagraha philosophy and the practice of placating the oppressor. New Delhi's inability to stand up to the United States is a further indication that India increasingly sees itself as one adversary of China, and second, and for that reason, India, well, I should not say that reason, but that is certainly one reason why India joined the United States in planning, well, let's say, planning and proposing the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, IMEC for short. And this IMEC corridor is supposed to be an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. In other words, here again, India has joined hands with the United States in order to block, as far as possible, the rise of China. And in this situation, a further weakness that has come out of the freedom struggle organized by Gandhi and Nehru is a terrible lack of sense of history. As you know, Indian history, and here I mean modern India, not ancient India, because in ancient times there was no India. There was only a region, what Hindutva activists call Bharat, or what uh, Greeks and Arabs referred to as as uh, uh, as people of the Indus region. Here meaning the Indus River. Now, the lack of history is something that Indian historians and intellectuals, for good reason, for at least for a basic sense of pride, have refused to admit that the history of India actually begins with the Battle of Plassey in the 1700s. That is the first time that the East India Company conquered the, the princely state, or shall we say the kingdom of Bengal. And having conquered the kingdom of Bengal, then the multinational company, which is the East India Company, continued to fight wars with other kingdoms in Mysore, against the Marathas, and so on. So what the East India Company did was to conquer each major kingdom or empire and incorporate it within the company's territory. And over time, this gradually became Company's India. And it, it is this history of conquest and submission, that historians are trying to mask by implying that India has an ancient history. The result of having this atrocious history for India, that is India as a conquered colony. And based on that, building a history has been very difficult. So there has been attempts by the different schools of thought on history in India to reach back to the past and somehow imagine that India, as we know today, does not have a history that begins with the British East India Company, but actually its history goes back thousands of years. And on the one hand, there are the secular historians. An important personality in that is Professor Romila Thapar. And on the other hand, there are the Hindutva historians, shall we say, religion-based historians. And the leading personality was Savarkar, who argued that India is essentially a Hindu nation, and therefore the Hindus should be enjoying pride of place. And so to support this, Golwakar came along and said the RSS, the Rashtriya Seva Sangh, is the militant wing of Hindu Mahasabha, which was headed by Savarkar, that the militant wing is going to now struggle for the independence or the liberation of the Hindus in India. So we have these two major historical perspectives. The third one, some Indians would like to believe, is the historical view of India as a socialist state promoted by the Indian Communist Party. But that, as we know, did not gain much traction. As far as the secular historians are concerned, they have run into a very serious problem. They like to argue, and here they go back to Nehru. Nehru, who argued that actually India should be secular and democratic. But how does one explain secularism when it is not a part of the society's culture? Just to give you an anecdote, in the early 1990s, when I was in New Delhi, I was invited to a seminar at a leading university, a postgraduate seminar, in which the point of discussion was how to combat the rising influence of the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, and its Hindutva agenda. And those students, and I'm sure these are some of the leading intellectuals in India, they were trying to analyze how best intellectuals could combat this what they call odious rise of Hindu nationalism. And when they discussed this issue of combating Hindutva, I had no disagreements. But while they discussed the issue of secularism, of promoting secularism, of making sure there is an educational system that privileges a secular approach to history, I could not help asking them. I asked them, how many major Indian languages have a word for secularism? And I was surprised. Well, actually, I wasn't surprised, but it was, in a sense, expected that those postgraduate students and faculty who were at the seminar could not remember the word secularism in any of the major Indian languages. And I suggested to them, if secularism is not a commonly used word, if not commonly at least used among intelligentsia's discussion on politics, if secularism is not a commonly used word, or in fact is totally absent, which means that among the vast majority in the country, they do not have any concept of secularism. And therefore, secularism, as discussed in that seminar, I said to the members, is really secularism of the anglicized intelligentsia in India. And if that is the case, how does one convince the vast majority of, especially the non-English speaking people in India, to not only accept secularism as a concept, but actually even understand what it actually means? Now, it is this weakness that the Hindutva movement has exploited, that actually the people have no idea of what secularism is. By people, I mean the vast majority, have no idea what secularism actually means, and therefore their Hindutva project has received considerable acceptance. The other point that Nehru had emphasized, one was that secularism, the other point was democracy. Now, Nehru had assumed, and with him, the historians in India, the historians that followed the secular tradition, or shall we say the Congress historians, they also said we must have democracy. But they did not stop to ask the question, or if at all the question was raised, it was never properly answered. How can there be democracy in a society that is hierarchically ordered on the basis of caste? How can there be equality of all individuals before the law? Now, this is something that is not addressed, something that the post independence intelligentsia, who was promoting secularism and democracy, had no answer to. In fact, what was happening is that the parliamentary system of elections actually took advantage of the caste system, the hierarchy of castes, and they built up vote banks based on each caste. And in that sense, the parliamentary system actually reinforced the caste divisions and gave political coherence to the otherwise irrational and I would say unacceptable system of caste divisions. It is these two problems that Congress historians could not resolve, and it is these two aspects which Hindutva has also taken up for its own advantage. As I said, Hindutva took advantage of the fact that secularism makes no sense to the vast majority of Indians. And in terms of democracy, Hindutva argues precisely that caste system is inherent and intrinsic to the Indian society, and therefore democracy, as proposed by the Congress historians, is anti-Indian. It does not take into account the cultural realities of India. Now, it is on these two areas in which we see a battle now emerging between the Congress historians and the Hindutva historians. We will follow this up at the next discussion, and until then, I hope you enjoyed our talk, and please like and subscribe. And for the moment, goodbye.